Hello and welcome to this class. This is Module 7 within the class Educational Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie. Within this class we'll be talking a little bit about classroom management. Now, classroom management is really about coordinating and orchestrating an entire set or sequence of learning activities so that everyone, whether they're misbehaving or not, learns as easily and productively as possible. Now, teachers sometimes describe good management as the creation of a positive learning environment because the term calls attention to the totality of activities and how they engage people in a classroom, as well as they orient people towards the goals and expectations about learning. Now, when we teach, we sometimes will laugh to ourselves about the word management there, because we're dealing with individual students' behavior and learning. And so sometimes it's better to speak of a learning environment, something that we can influence a little bit better. We're really looking for here, though, the overall feel of the classroom. Yes, there's going to be disruptions. There's no way that you can get around that. But it's the overall environment that needs to be positive within the classroom. Now, managing the learning environment is really a major responsibility and something that takes constant concern of any teacher. It doesn't matter if you're a new teacher or someone that has been teaching for their entire career. It is something that is constant. And there's lots of reasons for this. There's a lot going on in the classroom. Even when students seem to be doing only one task in common, there are different speeds that they're doing it. They're contributing in different ways. When you have 25 or 30 students working on a sheet of math problems, there are some that are stuck on a particular problem. There are some that finished early and now are wanting to chat with people around them, and others that are just, wondering what they're going to do next, or wondering what they're going to do at recess. So at any given moment, there's different things going on. There's different information being thought about, different hints that are needed, different kinds of encouragement that need to take place on the part of the teacher. And this kind of diversity is something that is just simply part of you engaging your students. And so it's important for you to enjoy this part of the job, because otherwise you're going to burn out fairly quickly. One of the reasons for managing the environment is because a teacher can't predict everything that's going to happen in the class. You can plan out the lesson well, and sometimes it's just going to fall flat. And you don't need to beat yourself up about it. It's just something that happens from time to time. Less expected things can happen. A student can act out. There can be a disagreement within the class. But sometimes there can be something wonderful that happens as well. There can be a positive, sustained exchange between students. And you don't want to break up the flow of that. But there's also interruptions that happen continually. Someone will come into the classroom for a visit. There will be a fire drill. There will be an announcement over the intercom system from the principal's office. All sorts of things can happen, and any one of those things can disrupt the flow within the class. Now, it's also important to manage the classroom in the form of opinions and perceptions. And part of that has to do with ensuring that there is a sense of positivity and justice and care within the classroom. And there's that fine line when you're engaging, when a classmate is engaging someone that generally seems to be powerless or shy. And there's that fine line of, okay, are they encouraging that person or are they coercing that person? So there needs to be a constant eye watched for that. And we also need to make sure that we're not ignoring students that are simply quiet. Now, at the broadest sense of classroom management, there are challenges with teaching because you get students from everywhere. And so there will be students within your class that simply do not want to learn. Students might not see school as an opportunity that exists to learn. They might see it as a prison, and they might have a very negative view of the school environment and create a toxic environment around them. And it's important for you to continue to work on creating that positive learning environment so that everyone, including that student, has the opportunity to learn. Now, fortunately, it's possible to commit yourself to each of these students and to prevent management problems as you are creating this environment. And there's several different methods. There's different ways of arranging your classroom space. There's different procedures or routines or rules that can be established that create a sense of fairness within the class. We'll also look at how we can refocus a student's mind when they stray from the task at hand and help them to find their way back into that space within their mind where they can focus their mind and their attention and their energy on a positive learning environment. So we'll look at all of that within this class. Now, one of the things that we need to always be mindful of is preventing problems within the classroom. And a lot of problems are ones that occur because we haven't planned something out properly. And so probably the best way to deal with a problem is to avoid opportunities for those problems to arise in the first place. So it's important to take some time, particularly at the beginning of the school year, to plan things out so that you are minimizing behavior problems. And you do that, first off, by arranging the classroom in an appropriate way. And secondly, by arranging materials in a way that encourages students to focus upon the learning as much as possible. And it's also important to establish procedures and rules that support focus on learning. And all of that works together then to create this positive learning environment. So arranging the classroom is something that can be done in many different ways. A lot of variations exist because there are different grade levels, there are different subjects that are taught, and the teacher's philosophy of education. And of course, the size of the physical space and the kinds of furniture that you have available are all going to play into this. Now, whatever the arrangement that you choose, it should help the students to focus on learning tasks as much as possible and minimize the chances of distractions. Now, beyond these basic principles, the best arrangement depends on what your students need and on the kind of teaching that you prefer and feel able to provide. The next issues have to do with what you can do on the wall, with technology, with visibility. And all of this I want you to continually experiment with and find that place that works best for you and your style. So all classrooms have walls, for example. And you should fill them with things that convey a mood and a feeling in the classroom that is positive. Normally, you will have ample display space in your room, so it's important to create a room that is interesting and that can reinforce the curriculum goals and display, for example, students' works. Now, not too many displays so that the room feels busy or distracting, especially if you have a smaller physical space, but something that is set up there that encourages pride in a student's work. Now, this is a good strategy for decorating the walls or bulletin boards, and always leaving some open space so that you have some flexibility to respond to new ideas or new curriculum that might emerge, or just to have some space in your classroom that has something that is positive and interesting, but that isn't your students' works. Now, be careful with choosing displays that are high maintenance, like, for example, an aquarium or plants or something like that. Now, these can be great learning aids, but they also take a lot of time to take care of, not only for the students, but for yourself as well. And so just be mindful that you need to manage your time and your energy level as well. Now, if you feel that you have the time and energy for it, then great. They're fantastic opportunities. Just remember that they are going to take a lot of time and energy to maintain those high energy displays. Now, ideally, you're going to have computers in your classroom. Oftentimes, though, you're only going to have one computer in the classroom, or just a few, and their placement's going to be in a predetermined location because of power outlets and internet cables and so on. And so you need to think about computer placement early on in the process while you're setting up your classroom. Because once the location of the computers is set, then you need to think about locations for desks, high usage shelves, and other movable items, and where they will be. And you need to decide where can they be so that they minimize distraction to students and avoid unnecessary traffic congestion areas around the computers. Because inevitably, computers are going to be a popular place for students to be. As far as there being interaction with students, it's important to think about where you're going to put the furniture and have space that allows you, as the teacher, to see all the students and to interact with all of them in a comfortable space. Now, usually this means that the main central part of the room, where desks and tables are usually located, needs to be a space that is open and as spacious as possible. Now, while this might seem obvious, enacting it can be a challenge in practice if the room itself is oddly shaped or is small. Now, in a classroom, particularly with younger grades, kindergarten, grade 1, open space tends to allow, if not invite, physical movement by children. And so you need to consider, is this going to be constructive movement, or is this going to be annoying, distractive movement? And so you're going to need to develop your environment around that physical space, the way that you have set it up. Now, as I mentioned, an open space for younger grades is an invitation for movement. That can change as you go up with the grades. So the best arrangement sometimes depends on the grade level or the subject area of the class. Now, if you're teaching in elementary school, for example, you need to think especially about where students keep their daily belongings, their coats, their lunches, and such. Now, in some schools, these can be kept outside the classroom, but that's not necessarily the case for all schools. And some subjects and grade levels lend themselves especially well to small group interaction, in which case you might prefer not to seat students in rows, but instead around small group tables or work areas. Now, work areas are sometimes preferred by elementary school teachers, but it's also useful in high schools where students need lots of counter space, or in some shops or art courses where they need to interact with each other, or in English as a second language courses where they need to discuss things with each other. The key issue in deciding between, for example, tables and rows isn't necessarily grade level or subject, but in the amount of small group interaction you want to encourage compared to the amount of whole group interaction that you want to encourage versus the amount of individual solo work that you want to encourage. You also want to, of course, have a space that is somewhat flexible and is convenient for the student. So give some thought to what will you be teaching, what's the grade level, and then what is your educational philosophy? Are you someone that is going to be very technical and impulsive in your lesson plans and teaching, or are you somebody that is going to encourage more social learning and encourage interaction and being able to play with the knowledge between students within a small group? All of that is going to play into what you will do as far as arranging your classroom. Then, of course, you're going to want to establish some procedures and routines that are constantly repeated within the classroom and within tasks. And this creates a predictable pattern within the students' lives and helps to reduce stress for the students. For example, checking daily attendance, dealing with students who arrive late, granting permission to leave the classroom for an errand. You're going to also want to have some established procedures that everybody understands as far as turning in daily homework, or gaining the teacher's attention during quiet seat work, or starting a free choice activity within the classroom. All of these procedures are very practical, and they help to create an environment that is positive and flows smoothly. When everybody understands the rules and the procedures, the entire life of the school works better. As well, you're going to want to create some procedures that help to manage behavior that is desirable. Now, and there should probably be some discussion in there as far as the constructivist nature of these rules, that sometimes these are social conventions. And so just being able to recognize that they are social conventions, and that is part of creating a positive environment within the classroom. Now, unlike procedures and routines, there are rules that express standards of behavior for each individual student, and each individual student is expected to take responsibility for these rules. Although they're like procedures in that they sometimes help to ensure efficiency in the classroom tasks, they're really about encouraging students to be responsible for learning and showing respect for each other. So, an example of some classroom rules to have in place: treat others with courtesy and politeness. Make sure to bring required materials to class and to activities. Be on time for class and other activities. Okay? Basic rules that encourage responsibility are always helpful. Now, what about pacing and structuring lessons and activities? One of the best ways to prevent management problems is by pacing and structuring lessons or activities as smoothly and as continuously as possible. And this goal depends on three major strategies. First, you want to be selecting tasks or activities in an appropriate level of difficulty for the students. So you want to keep them engaged. You want to be providing a moderate level of structure or clarity for students about what they're supposed to do, especially during transitions between activities. As a teacher, you want to keep alert to the flow and interplay of behaviors for the class as a whole and for individuals within it. And so each of these strategies can help to create a positive learning environment. So I just want to talk about them a little more closely here. So when we're choosing tasks that are an appropriate level of difficulty, an experienced teacher knows and has done research to confirm that students are most likely to engage with learning when tasks are of a moderate difficulty. They're not too easy that they get bored, and they're not so hard that they get discouraged. And this keeps the student in that place of creating a challenge that they need to overcome, and in so doing, it keeps their attention, and that can be very helpful. You also want to provide a moderate amount of structure and detail. Now, chances are that at some point in your educational career, you wished that a teacher would clarify or explain an assignment more fully, and perhaps give it a clearer structure or organization. Students' desire for clarity is especially common with assignments that are by nature open-ended, such as long essays, large projects, or creative works. Simply being told to write an essay critiquing the novel sometimes leaves a huge room of uncertainty. However, You also don't want to stifle the creativity of the student. And so not too much structure, but enough structure that they can begin the process is always helpful. And the thing to keep in mind is that there are different levels of this required throughout the grades. Now, if a student has not had an opportunity to do this kind of work before, then more structure is helpful. But sometimes the goal is to, particularly in higher grades, the goal is to encourage the student to seek out information about creating their own structure within the assignment, so that they form a sense of autonomy in their work. And so in higher grades, and more oftentimes in university, teachers and professors will give a very general assignment and then put the onus on the student to create the structure, the focus, the topic of what needs to be done. And this encourages the student to engage their peers in discussing the assignment and clarifying for themselves what they will be doing within that assignment. So it's all part of the zone of proximal development. That's part of the learning process. Where is the student and what kinds of structure do they need within the assignment? That's something to always be mindful of. Now, we also need to think about managing transitions. Transitions between activities is often a time that's full of distractions, a lost time, some would say. It's a time when inappropriate behaviors are likely to occur. And part of the problem is intrinsic in transitions. Students have to wait for the new activity to begin, and sometimes they're going to get bored. One of the best ways of moving from one transition to another is have a discussion topic for small groups of students to discuss and to share their experiences about that topic. In so doing, you have time to transition to the next assignment, and it keeps them engaged in something that is positive and educational. So that's one way of doing it. Another strategy is for you as teacher to organize materials as well as possible ahead of time so that you minimize the time that you need to begin a new activity. Another strategy, which is a more complex strategy, is to teach the students to manage their own behavior during these transitions. If students talk too loudly at these times, for example, then discuss with them what constitutes appropriate levels or amounts of talk, and discuss the need for them to monitor their own sound level. Or if students stop work early in anticipation of ending an activity, then talk about or even practice waiting for a signal from the teacher to indicate the true ending point for an activity. And all of this will help the student to manage these transitions. Now, it's also important to maintain the flow of activities. There's a lot of classroom management that is really about keeping activities flowing smoothly, both during individual lessons and across the entire school day. The trouble is that there is never just one event happening at a time. Even if only one activity has been formally planned and is supposed to be occurring, There's lots of times when there are different things going on, different topics being discussed, individual students bringing up a concern from another class in their discussion with other students. And all of that can cause disruption problems. Now, a common mistake of beginning teachers in these complex settings is to pay too much attention to any one activity or student or small group at the expense of noticing and responding to all the others. Now, if you are helping a student on one side of the class when someone on the other side disturbs classmates with off-task conversation, it can be less effective either to finish with the student you are helping before attending to the disruption, or to interrupt yourself to solve the disruption on the other side of the classroom. Now, one of these responses may be necessary, but either of them involves a disruption somewhere. And there's a risk that either the student's chatting may spread to others, or the interrupted student is going to get bored waiting for the teacher's attention to get back to them, and they're going to wander off task themselves. Now, a better solution, but one that can be challenging, particularly for a new teacher, is to attend to both at the same time. Now, sometimes a teacher is going to call this with-itness. And this comes from some research about with-itness. Now, with-itness does not mean that you focus on all simultaneous activities with equal care, but only that you remain aware of the other things going on in the classroom and the other behaviors to some degree. You're not focused on simply one thing. So at any particular moment, you may be focusing on helping a student, but in some corner of your mind, you're also noticing when chatting begins on the other side of the classroom, and you have, as the saying goes, you have eyes in the back of your head. You grow the eyes in the back of your head. And this has found, research into this strategy has found that experienced teachers are much more likely to show with-itness than inexperienced teachers, and that these qualities are associated with managing classrooms effectively. So simply being able to, while you're helping the student and there's a disruption on the other side of the classroom, you simply draw attention to the disruption on the other side of the classroom as you are simultaneously helping the teacher, can help to manage that situation. Now, it's important to have enthusiasm and to display positive attitudes. We've talked a little bit about arranging the space and the procedures and the rules and developing with-itness, but it's also important to convey positive emotions within the classroom. Positive emotions create an excitement for the learning. Students catch emotions from the teacher, and so it's important to practice positive emotions within the classroom. It's also helpful to give timely feedback. Timely feedback helps the student to find where they are on task, where they are off task, and it develops the social skill of maturity to help guide the student through the process. A score on the test is more informative immediately after a test than it is 6 months afterwards. A student's probably going to have forgotten what the content of the test was. A teacher's comment to a student about an inappropriate off-task behavior may not be especially welcome at the moment of the behavior occurs, but it can be more influential and informative then. And later, both the student and teacher will have trouble remembering the details of the off-task behavior. So small positive feedback is especially helpful within the teaching process. Just be mindful of that. It's like a conversation. It's a constant conversation that goes on. In any kind of communication that goes on, there is the nodding of the head, the yes, yes, oh, interesting. Those small little comments help to keep attention. And the same kind of thing needs to happen in teaching. There needs to be the small little timely feedbacks that indicate that the student is on task or off task, and all of that can help with the classroom management. And then finally, documentation. You need to remember that documentation is part of the foundation of professionalism. And so it's important to always record what is going on. It's helpful to keep a daily journal about what went on during the day. Of course, it's important to always organize keys and record very promptly things like scores and marks and grades. I encourage you to, if you have a short quiz, to mark it right away, to post the marks as soon as possible. And all of this requires some planning. It requires time to process. But in the end, if you are documenting things continually, you have a quick and ready and easy way of evaluating the student's works. And this reduces any strain you have later on when it comes time for the teacher to evaluate the student. And all of this is important. You can't keep all of this information in your head. Accurate records are helpful not only for scores on tests and quizzes and assignments, but also for developing descriptive summaries of the nature of the student's academic skills or progress. Now, a common way to develop a description is a student portfolio, which is a compilation of the student's work and ongoing assessments. And this helps to have some examples of what is going on with the student. To know how a student's science project evolved from its beginning, for example, a teacher and student can keep a portfolio of lab notes, of logs, of preliminary data and the like. To know how a student's writing skills have developed, they could keep a portfolio of early drafts of various writing assignments. And as the work accumulates, the student can discuss it with the teacher and write a brief reflection on its strengths thus far and on the steps needed to improve the work further. And this engages the student in the learning and the development process by providing a way to respond to work as it evolves, and by including students in making the assessments. Portfolios provide relatively prompt feedback. And in any case, they provide it sooner than by waiting for the teacher to review the work that is complete or final. And so that's something that needs to be kept in mind as well. So in summary, just be mindful that classroom management is about creating a positive learning environment. It's about preventing problems, helping the student to focus on learning. It's about you as the teacher arranging the space, creating displays and using the wall space wisely, organizing things so that technology can be used in a way that does not cause disruptions, that there is visibility and interaction that's able to take place between you and the students, and that it's all arranged to meet the needs of the students and of your lesson plans. It's important to have procedures in place for different things within the classroom. It's also important for the students to understand some basic rules about how to treat others within the classroom. And that helps to create a positive learning environment. For you as the teacher, it's important to pace activities, to make them difficult, but not too difficult, to manage transitions, to maintain the flow, to show enthusiasm, and to give timely feedback. And in the end, to document all of this. And in so doing, you will be on your way to being a positive, caring teacher. It's also important to communicate with caregivers. Now, since parents and caregivers are entrusting their children to you, teachers are responsible to keep them informed and involved to whatever extent is practical. Virtually all parents understand and assume that schools are generally intended for learning. And detailed communication can really enrich the parent's understanding of how learning is addressed and how it is helping their students in any particular case. So the more that you can engage in a positive way with the parents or caregivers in supporting the child's learning in a confident, positive, intelligent way, the more that's going to support the learning environment with the student. The important thing here is to frame things in a positive way, that there's always an opportunity for growth and for learning, and in so doing, communicate enthusiasm. Parents can be very defensive when speaking with a teacher, and they can be as afraid as a student about speaking with a teacher. And so it's important to help to manage that and to create a positive communication environment with the teacher. Now, inevitably, students are going to misbehave. So we need to focus on preventing behaviors that are inappropriate or annoying. The advice really has to do with being proactive and forward-looking by planning out your classroom space, establishing your rules, pacing your lessons. All of that goes a long way to managing misbehavior. But we also need to remember that misbehavior can be contagious and that it can cause a ripple effect. Chatting between two students can eventually be chatting between all the students in the classroom. And so we need to be mindful how to manage all of that. Now, there's a lot of misbehaviors that are not important or frequent enough to deserve any response at all, because they're likely to disappear. They're likely to extinguish themselves, as a behaviorist would say, simply if left alone. If a student who is usually quiet during class happens to whisper to a neighbor once in a while, it is probably less disruptive and just as effective to ignore the infraction than to respond to it. Some misbehaviors may not be worth a response, even if they are frequent, as long as they do not seem to bother others. So be mindful of how much of a disruption really is this, and how can we communicate or ignore that. Now, sometimes it works to communicate using gestures or eye contact or body language that involves little or no speaking. A simple non-verbal cue can communicate that you recognize that this is inappropriate misbehavior and that the student should stop. And the student often will see your teacher's look and stop the behavior. So sometimes that is the best way to do things. If you are going to speak to them, try to keep it positive and caring. And in so doing, you are not damaging the positive relationship that you have with the student, and simply invite them to consider other people in what they're doing. And most times that will be the best way that you can deal with communicating with the student verbally about the misbehavior. Then there are consequences that are outcomes or results of an action. And when managing a classroom, there are two kinds of consequences that are especially effective in influencing students' behaviors: natural consequences and logical consequences. As the term implies, natural consequences happen naturally without deliberate intention by anyone. If a student is late for class, for example, a natural consequence is that he misses information or material that they needed in order to do an assignment. Then there are logical consequences, and these are ones that happen because of the responses of or decisions by others, but that also have an obvious or logical relationship to the original action. If one student, for example, steals another's lunch, for example, a logical consequence might be that the thief to reimburse the victim for the cost of the lunch. Now, these natural and logical consequences are often woven together, and sometimes they're hard to extinguish. But highlighting and supporting natural and logical consequences can go a long way to teaching the students to make more positive choices. Now, when focusing on things, it is helpful to, as much as possible, to be positive. You want to always use the relationship that you have with the student as leverage to encourage the student to feel good about themselves, but also if they're doing something that is harming someone else or disrupting others, to be mindful of that, incorporate that into their thinking process. Now, sometimes there is conflict that happens. When a student's misbehavior persistently and disruptively impacts others, you'll need to have a strategy that's more active and more assertive than what we've talked about thus far. And this is where conflict resolution comes in. The first part of conflict resolution is your rational detachment. And I've talked about that a little bit before. Your rational detachment is you not getting caught up in the crisis, you having a clear head, you detaching your emotions from the situation, and you simply being clear and clear-minded and not controlled emotionally by the situation. Then, from that point, you can clarify and focus and identify problem ownership. Classrooms can be an emotional space, and so you need to be mindful that emotions are caught. And so part of your job as the teacher is to convey emotions that are calm and that do not get caught up in the disruption of others. Now, the owner of the problem is the primary person who is troubled or bothered by the problem. And so it's important to identify ownership. The owner can be the student committing the behavior. Sometimes it's the teacher, or sometimes another student who merely happens to see the behavior. Now, since the owner of the problem needs to take responsibility for solving it, identifying ownership makes a difference in how to deal with the behavior or the problem. So that's part of the first step. The next part is being active and being an empathetic listener. Diagnosing accurately who really has a problem with the behavior, who owns it, is helped by a number of strategies. One of those is the active listening, where you are attending carefully to what is happening in the situation. You are responding, and you are encouraging the conversation to continue in a calm, reasonable way. This involves encouraging the student to elaborate on what they have said, and then paraphrasing or summarizing what the student says in order to check that your perceptions as the teacher are accurate. And it's important here to do this slowly. That calms down the emotions, and that allows you to gather the kinds of information that you need in order to move towards a resolution within this conflict. So take your time in this situation. Now, once you've listened well to the student's point of view, it helps to frame your responses and comments in terms of how the student's behavior affects you in particular, especially as your role in the teacher. Now, they should be assertive, because you do have power as a teacher, so don't be passive or apologetic about it. But you don't want to be hostile and aggressive either. You don't want to be attacking. But in so doing, you can use I statements. And when you use an I statement, you retain control, because you are expressing what you have control of within yourself. So an I statement conveys that you have a perception about what is going on. And this is distinct from a you message, which focuses on evaluating the mistake or problem which the student has created. By having the I statement, you retain control and are able to engage in a way that is expressing your perception and not an absolute judgment. Then there should be some negotiation that takes place. Now, the first few steps within conflict resolution are desirable, but also fairly specific in their scope and limited in their duration. They help you to establish an environment within which you can now, at this step of negotiation, you can work towards resolution. So it's important to negotiate a solution, and in so doing, no one is powerless. And that helps for the student that is misbehaving and the one that has the ownership of the problem. Both have a say in what is happening here. And this can happen through discussion, this can happen through brainstorming, and it's important to have a calm conversation about what a resolution to this problem can be. Ideally, you want to find a consensus and help everyone to pay attention to what has happened, so that this can be a learning opportunity and that everyone can come out a better person from this conflict. So that's a way of dealing with conflict. The last thing I just want to highlight here is that sometimes little disruptions or disruptions that happen in a way from someone that you would normally not expect the disruption to come from. Sometimes those things you don't need to respond to. Everyone is going to have a moment from time to time where they're going to be disruptive in some way. And we don't need to constantly be highlighting those things, but at the same time, we need to be aware of them, and we need to develop a sense of intuition about what will work and what will not work in this situation. That can be very difficult for a beginning teacher, but just know that eventually it will get easier. And recognize that you do have power with your words, that you have power with your looks, and use those in a positive, uplifting way. And in so doing, this will begin to create a positive learning environment for everyone. So it's important to keep calm and to teach on. You are the foundation of the emotions within the classroom. And so try to keep everything within perspective and remember that you love teaching. I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.